to the good old days. Let me take you back to the good old days. Let me take you back to the good old days.
Oh, yeah.
Let me take you back to the good old days. Let me take you back to the good old days. Let me take you back to the good old days. Let me take you back
Old school, let's go
back to the good old days.
Let's take
Let me take you back
let's go
to the good old days. Let me take you back to the good old days. Let me take you back.
Kia ora na tātou katoa. Talofa lava malole soifua maua malelangia mama. Ni sambolevinaka ke muni sakanoa kanda mai viti. Welcome everyone to Talanoa With Tupe. This is a show which is bi-Pacific, about the Pacific region and its people. Our guest today is the first international leader to visit New Zealand since borders closed over a year ago. We are so honoured to have the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, Te Ara Rangatira, the Honourable Mark Brown. Kia ora ki a koe e te tama aka aere o te kuki airani. Mei taki maata no tō taua ara veanga I te ara. Greetings, Prime Minister. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Tēnā koe, kia ora na Tupe. Great to be here.
Let's start at the very beginning, Prime Minister. So you were born in Wellington and grew up in Avarua on Rarotonga. Can you tell us about your family environment growing up?
Yes, I was born here in Wellington. The story goes I'm a product of my father's posting when he was posted to Wellington to do work here. I was brought up by my grandparents who came and got me, took me back home. I was the first grandchild of my grandparents. And I lived with them for my early years on Rarotonga. Did most of my schooling there, of course, until we got a government scholarship to be able to finish secondary school, the seventh form year, where they sent us to Gisborne and had a year at Gisborne Boys High School with a couple of other boys from the Cook Islands to finish our secondary schooling there. So it was an interesting life that I've had. But the Cook Islands is home for me. Very close ties and links with family. But the places that I've spent during those years of school, of course, Gisborne is an interesting place as well.
Yes.
And then from there, went to university here, and I guess I've done a bit of travelling around after that in Australia and New Zealand before I finally settled back home. And of course, I've been there ever since.
So having spent part of your formative years here in New Zealand, what was your impression of New Zealand at the time?
I think for most Cook Islanders, you have a big Cook Island family in New Zealand anyway. New Zealand's always been seen as kind of like the big smoke that you come to. Everything's different here than it is back at home. But you enjoy your time here in New Zealand, your life here. And especially when I was at university here, that was quite a time when you combine your social life with your learning life to try and make the most of it. So certainly some good memories of my time spent in New Zealand, that seen me come back here on many occasions, of course, during my professional life and during my working career, and with family here in New Zealand as well. It's almost like a commute, I guess, now between New Zealand and Rarotonga.
So you mentioned that your grandparents played a pivotal role in your life, and you yourself are also a grandparent now.
Yes.
Yes. So can you tell us a little bit about your family?
Yes, that's right. I mean, I was brought up by my grandparents, and that was it. You lived in their big household along with everybody else, and those are really strong connections that we have living with your grandparents. They didn't speak English; they spoke Maori, so that was our language that we learned. You learned back in those days certain things you have to do. The hangi, as they call it here in New Zealand, the umu, we call it in Raro. Certain work that you had to do as a kid. Those are all, instilled into you a very, very young age when you're brought up by your grandparents. But of course, yes, just 7 months ago, my eldest daughter gave birth to the first grandchild. So I now have a title as well as Prime Minister. My title is Papa. So I think that'll last a bit longer than the Prime Minister title that I currently have. But certainly having a grandchild puts a new perspective on things. You can yell at your kids, but you don't yell at your grandchildren, that's for sure, I can tell you. But my daughter sends me a video clip of her every morning. And at 7 months of age, she's getting to that stage where they're starting to make noises, they want to talk, they're very active and wanting to get out and move about. So she just starts off my day with a bang when she sends those videos through and sets me off into a good mood before I get into work.
My parents always say that it's a grandparent's right to spoil. So
Definitely.
definitely a different dynamic than the parent-child relationship. Can you tell us who was a pivotal figure for you growing up? Who was the most influential person in your life when you were growing up?
I guess at different stages there are different people that would influence you. So for me, early on, my grandparents were very influential on my life, getting there. Then I lived with my parents for a stage with my younger sisters. And again, then the influence of my parents became very, very strong in those years. Going away to school and then going off and living on your own after university is when I guess you try to find your identity, your independence as a young person, explore the world and see what's out there. But coming back into the country again, my parents had a very strong influence over me when I got back home and started working in Rarotonga. In my political life, I'd have to say that my mother was a very strong influence. She was very active politically. And she, I guess, influenced myself onto this road of politics. One of the former leaders of the Cook Islands Party, Sir Geoffrey, another very influential person from a political perspective on learning the lessons of politics. But for me, I think those were the key people that I thought provided an influence on my life to where I am today. It's when you think about it, the life has been going forward at a fairly rapid pace for me. So taking the time to reflect and think back, the immediate influences that come to mind are those for me. Of course, there would be others at certain points in my life that would have had an influence, but for me, these people were definitely the strongest influences.
So you became the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands in October 2020 during a global health crisis and probably the greatest challenge that the world has seen since World War II. So it's a time that calls for a unique style of leadership. So you've mentioned some of the people who have influenced you over the years. How would you describe your particular brand of leadership?
I think my style of leadership is one of trying to work with people, trying to win people over, but at the same time having a very clear purpose of what you want to do. So when I got into politics, I first got elected now 11 years ago, but I got involved in politics before that, joining the Cook Islands Party back home. And there was really a choice. You could either stand back and complain and yell about things that you weren't happy with, or you could get into it and make the changes you wanted and do the things you wanted to do. So that's what I wanted to do, was get in there and make a difference, make a change, improve the way that delivery of service to our people was being done, create opportunities for our business to be able to progress and move ahead, and really get in there and from a Cook Islands perspective and from a Cook Islanders perspective is to set the tone of what you want to be done in your country, rather than we had often in the past people coming into our country and saying, this is what you should do and that's what you should do and that's how you should do it. I've always believed and felt that if you really want to make a difference, if you really want your country to step forward, then the country, we have to set our pace. We have to set our map, and we have to drive and deliver what we want for our country. And that's really where I see my role of the last 10 years has been to change that thinking across our country, across the public service in particular, about not relying on others to do what we should be doing ourselves. And we've carried that thought, that principle as a government since I got into government to today, and we continue that process from here going forward as well.
Well, we have to take a break now, but when we come back, let's talk some more about the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the Cook Islands.
Sure.
Welcome back to Talanoa With Tupe. I'm here with the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, the Honourable Mark Brown. Prime Minister, I want to take you back to March 2020. So the Cook Islands had just closed its borders and countries around the world were doing the same. At the time you were the Deputy Prime Minister, what was going through your mind, particularly considering that 65% of your economy relies on tourism?
Well, as a country, we've been very fortunate that we've come through at least the last 7 years of period of exceptional economic growth. So we were in a very good position when the borders closed. But I can tell you that our private sector, our tourism businesses in particular, they were absolutely terrified about the impact of no tourists for the foreseeable future. So for us, we had no time to really start to worry about things. We had to put in place an emergency rescue package to help these businesses who had no way to pay their workers the following week, who had no idea how they're going to settle their debts at the bank, and no idea really how they're going to meet other financial obligations. Because of the good position we were in, we were able to craft a support package very, very quickly and give assurance and allay a lot of the fear that arose immediately after the closure of our borders. So that, for us, bought us a bit of time to step back and then think more deeply about how long this crisis is going to continue. What are the measures that we need to put in place additional to what we've done initially? And I think, looking back now, I think we have done things as well as could be done. In fact, probably a lot better than many other countries, how they responded. But there was no time to be worried, no time to be fearful. It was really time for quick, decisive action. And that's what we did. And I know that provided a lot of comfort for our people and for the businesses that were affected. But a huge proportion of our economy, 65 to 75% of GDP affected. These are not just hotels, restaurants and hire companies. These are growers who provide their product to that particular industry, fishermen who catch fish and sell to these markets, market vendors whose markets are tourists that come through. So it's a really widespread impact on the wider economy and not just tourism for us. But that was the response that we had. Right at the forefront of our thinking to close the borders was health and safety, because nobody knew much about this disease at the time. So we knew that there was going to be a cost in terms of our economy and a downturn, a reduction in incomes for our people. But our people embraced the approach that we took to close the borders because, like us, they were scared and they were worried about their health as well as they're worried about their livelihoods. So we've maintained that priority up to this day.
I'm not sure if people in New Zealand, Australia and beyond fully appreciate the additional pressure that this puts small island states and on top of all of the vulnerabilities that normally face small island states. From the stories that you've been hearing locally, what is the mental health like of Cook Islanders generally? That's
a really important question, because when we did first start, there was fear about the disease, subsequent fear about loss of livelihoods. We managed to allay that by closing the borders and by providing a support package. From March until about June, July, people had a few months of lockdown, and there were the confidence in our people was starting to drop We then came up with the concept of the Cook Island Games, which was held in October. And I didn't think it would have such an uplifting effect on the people, that people would embrace it, join it, and be part of it. But for us, it was like the Olympic Games. I couldn't believe the number of people that participated in all of the sports that were put across. And that lifted the spirits of our people. And it carried us through, I'd say, to December, January, through the new year. But again, the uncertainty of January and February has led to a loss of confidence in people. And it's now affecting, as you mentioned, the mental health of many people. So when you start to have your population start to lose hope, looking forward at no chance of earning the incomes that they were earning before, we start to see what's happening now in our country, people leaving, coming to New Zealand and working for the meat works, working in the horticultural industry, which are crying out for workers. And that's what's happening to our country. So for us, we had to look at a way to address this loss of hope, this loss of confidence, to arrest the departure, the depopulation of our people coming to New Zealand. And the quickest, best way to get that to happen was to get our businesses back up and running. And that's why we're here talking to the New Zealand government about the commencement of our travel between our two countries.
Yes. So it's been agreed that the opening of the New Zealand Cook Islands travel bubble will likely be in May.
We've put our intentions to New Zealand that we would like to open for two-way quarantine-free travel between our two countries in May. Of course, New Zealand, Prime Minister Ardern herself, is very concerned about New Zealand possibly exporting the COVID virus to the Cook Islands. So there are some areas that we are working very closely with officials in New Zealand to assure and minimize the level of risk so that we can commence our two-way travel. But we're confident that our health preparedness, coupled with New Zealand's efforts in protecting its own country, together these provide more than enough assurance for us to commence two-way travel. And the date we've provided for commencement is the 1st of May. Of course, we'll still work with New Zealand on some of those issues that they've identified, on contact tracing, on surge protection, on managed isolation in the Cook Islands, to provide an assurance to them that we're ready for business.
The Cook Islands Chamber of Commerce has expressed some disappointment that there hasn't been more certainty around the date. And the Chamber President Fletcher Melvin says people are leaving the country, companies are deciding they can't stay open much longer, every day we lose $1 million in revenue. So what's your reaction to the Chamber's concerns, and what do you say to those who are seeking certainty?
Yes, those are our concerns as well, and the Chamber has echoed those. We've done an economic analysis on our economy, and we are losing over $1 million a day in lost revenue across the wider economy. So for us, the concerns that we have, we've heard them, and that is why we've set a date of 1st of May. We are opening. We're ready to accept Kiwis to come to Rarotonga. We have had a two-way quarantine-free travel since January this year, limited to Cook Islanders and work permit holders. So we've been able to operate the travel bubble since January, and right through the period when there was an outbreak in February in Auckland. Our response, of course, then was to halt passenger travel until an assurance could be provided that that outbreak was contained, and then we resumed again. And I think that is the way that we can expect travel to occur for the next year at least, that if there is an outbreak, countries like us will automatically suspend passenger travel until we can move again. But we've put in place other measures to add protection to our people. There's a requirement for people to have a negative COVID test 3 days before departure coming into our country, a requirement for people to have contact tracing on hand. And last week we launched our Bluetooth contact tracing app, which is interoperable with the system here in New Zealand. So Kiwis can use it in Raro, we can use it here in New Zealand. So these are all the measures that we've put in place to provide us assurance, provide our people assurance that when we do start tourism travel, New Zealand to Rarotonga, that we've done everything we can to minimise the risk of COVID coming into our country.
And it's expected that the vaccination program will begin in the Cook Islands in May, and that you will be making that voluntary. So you're no doubt aware of recent studies in New Zealand that show that only 61% of the Pasifika population here would be likely to take up the vaccine. Given the importance of the Cook Islands remaining COVID-19 free, what is your rationale around making the vaccination voluntary, and what do you think the uptake will be in the Cook Islands?
Good question. For us, the vaccination provides an added layer of protection. The Cook Islands historically has had very high vaccination rates in the past, up in the high 90%, which is why when they had an outbreak of measles in Samoa, it didn't affect our country because of that acceptance of vaccination. Prior to coming here, I'd spent last month travelling around all of our islands to advise and let people know about the vaccine that's coming in, and to encourage people to take up vaccination, but also to answer the questions that people had around vaccination. The usual questions that are being asked, I guess, in communities here. How safe is the vaccine? Who made the vaccine? Is anybody else been vaccinated with this vaccine? What are the side effects? We've been able to answer the questions of our people, and I think our people's tendency to have themselves protected outweighs the hesitancy that we're seeing in parts of New Zealand. So I'm confident that when we do roll out our vaccination program, the uptake will be very, very high. We've avoided going down the legal road of making vaccinations mandatory. They've never been mandatory in the past. We believe that our people, with their acceptance of vaccination, there will be a high enough uptake of vaccinations to make the vaccine program effective in our country. However, in saying that, I arrived last week in Auckland. I met with community leaders of the Cook Islands communities in Auckland, explained to them what we are doing back home in terms of vaccination and how every island that I've met are happy to start vaccinations. I met with the Poporazzi community while I was here in Wellington just on the weekend. Again, explained to them what we're doing here. So it's important that our leaders in our communities here in New Zealand, whether they be in the community leaders or church leaders, that they do send out a positive message, a message that's based on medical evidence, based on science, based on quality assurance, that the vaccinations here will save their lives. If you don't choose to vaccinate, then, prepare yourself for a burial.
Well, Prime Minister, we have to take a break, but when we come back, let's talk about the future of the Cook Islands.
Okay, sure.
Welcome back to Talanoa With Tupe. I'm here with the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, the Honourable Mark Brown. Prime Minister, as you're aware, well-known Cook Islands New Zealand entrepreneur Mike Pero will launch his airline Pasifika Air later this year, flying from Wellington and Christchurch to Rarotonga. I think it was Richard Branson who said that if you want to be a millionaire, start with $1 billion and then start an airline. Of course, if anyone's going to be successful, I think Mike Pero would probably be the man for the job. What do you think of his initiative?
I think in times of crisis, this is when entrepreneurs come to the fore. And I think Mike's initiative is a good one. Certainly there are opportunities that abound. Right now in the world, the airline industry is taking such a hammering. So the emergence of airlines and how they're going to operate going to be very different for quite a while. But there's no doubt that people have had a taste of international travel and they want to return back to that international travel. Mike has identified an opportunity for taking people from New Zealand to Rarotonga. For us, we're such a small microeconomy that small numbers of people make a difference in our country. Whether your tourism numbers coming in, whether they're numbers on an aircraft, they do make a difference for us. So for a startup airline that he's looking to come in, I think there is opportunity for them to take advantage of. Definitely with the lack of opportunity for Kiwis to fly anywhere else in the world, they will certainly look to a place like the Cook Islands. I understand Stewart Island and the Chatham Islands are now top tourism spots for Kiwis. They may be looking now for another island to go to, and therein lies the opportunity for an entrepreneur to fill that gap. Of course, airline economics play a big part in this, so it will depend on things like load factors, leasing costs for aircraft, landing costs in the Cook Islands and so forth. But this is where entrepreneurs are able to work these numbers and work their magic and make things work.
Prime Minister, it's very difficult to predict the future, especially in these uncertain times. But what does the future look like from your perspective? How hopeful are you that the Cook Islands will be able to make an economic recovery? And what keeps you up at night?
My baby keeps me up at night, but I don't mind that. But no, if you asked me this question 6-7 months ago, I would have agreed with you that there is the only thing that's certain is the uncertainty. But now we've come through a year, we now have a clear idea of what sort of numbers in terms of the economy, in terms of economics, we need to see us through to another year. We can see that the opportunities to recover are there now, and tourism remains a key component of that for us. The numbers that we had for arrivals into our country pre-COVID, we will be able to recover sufficiently with a proportion of that, a smaller proportion of those numbers. So we see the commencement of tourism for us as the road to recovery. The recovery won't be easy. Many of our businesses have spent all of their hard-earned profits earned over the last 7 to 10 years. They will be on a road to recovering their losses for the next 2 to 3 to 5 years before they start earning money again to reinvest back into growing the economy. And this is where the government comes in. We're doing what New Zealand is doing in putting in place a stimulus package to encourage infrastructure investment right across our countries. We're working with the New Zealand government, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, to ensure that we have capital financing, that it's a rate that's affordable to us to enable this stimulus package to roll out. Side by side with that is to move to diversify our economy. If there's one economy that is an example of putting all your eggs in one basket, it's the Cook Islands tourism economy. So the importance of diversification for us is critical. And in this regard, we are looking at our mineral resources that lie in our oceans. We have embarked on a program to understand more about the value of our resources lying in our oceans, going back 10 years. So this is not a sudden thing that we're embarking on as part of diversification. This is a sector that we've been thinking about for a very long time. This year we expect to issue licenses to companies for exploration in our waters, to provide us with the knowledge and information on the diversity that exists at the ocean depths, the environmental impacts that may occur from activities in our ocean, the mapping of our sea floor, all of the information that we need to enable us to make an informed decision on whether we harvest these resources or not. But these are what provides our country with the opportunities to look forward with confidence and with optimism. Because I know that our tourism product is ready to get back into business. During the downtime of the year, all of our property owners have spent their time refurbishing and repainting and just doing up their properties ready for business. We've got business operators that operated in an environment that is very, very tough to conduct business in. Cost of labour in the Cook Islands is the highest across the Pacific. Cost of imports is very high. The cost of transportation is high. Cost of electricity is high. So all of these cost factors, despite that, our economy has been able to sustain significant growth over the last 5 years of 25%, which saw us graduate to high income status as a country on the 1st of January last year. And then 3 months later, we shut the borders, all of that income stopped. But we have a business sector that knows how to operate in tough times, and we will be going through some tough times, but I'm confident in the ability to be able to get through it. For us, it's really coming through that and seeing what's beyond. And in this case, the sector that I mentioned about our oceans
Yes.
is going to be important for us. You know, we're a country that is 99.99% ocean, you know, 0.01% land, 15,000 people. Yet, prior to COVID, we generated a GDP of nearly $500 million. Pretty good performance from a country that has to look after this number of people, spread across 2 million square kilometres of ocean, isolated communities. We have to maintain 8 airstrips in our population. We have to maintain 10 ports, electricity generation, schools scattered amongst these communities, clinics. So it's not a easy business, but we know how to do business in our country, which leads me back to that discussion we had earlier about the importance of a country leading its own development, a country driving its own development, setting its own development agenda. Because if somebody else comes in and does it, they won't get it right. But we can get it right.
Yeah. Prime Minister, I think you've clearly outlined your plan as well as the need for diversification. And you've also touched on a country having to lead its own development, which sort of brings up one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is your plan for deep sea mining is somewhat at odds with some of the other views in the region. So what do you say to those who are calling for a 10-year moratorium on deep sea mining due to environmental concerns?
Well, we don't support a call for an arbitrary time frame before you're going to commence some sort of activity on the seafloor. We believe that any decision we make on harvesting of our mineral wealth should be on the basis of knowledge gained, on information, on an understanding of our ocean, our deep ocean, the biodiversity and the environmental impacts. We're not going to gain that by sitting back for 10 years. We need to get out there and see that. I'd also say that in terms of the mineral wealth, this is a resource that sits within jurisdictions of countries. Very different from the fishery. Our tuna fishery across the Pacific is a regional resource. So the tuna that swims through our waters also swims through Samoa, Fiji, Kiribati and others. The management of our fishery is done on a regional basis, done very successfully over the last 10 years to make sure that the returns to member countries are the best possible returns we can get from the distant water fishing nations that come into our waters. Our minerals do not swim across, they sit in our jurisdiction. In our case, these minerals exist only in that abundance in our waters, none of the other countries. We do not expect to advise countries like Fiji or New Caledonia how to exploit their mineral resources on their land and the environmental degradation that comes with that. We don't expect them to advise us on how we should exploit our mineral resources as well. But I can assure our people that the environmental concerns are also the concerns of our people. They're the concerns of our government, and we will not undertake any sort of activity on our seafloor that in any way damages our ocean or impacts the environment in a negative way. We will ensure that the minerals that are sought after in our nodules are collected in a way that is environmentally safe, because we do know that the minerals there will contribute to what the world is calling for in terms of converting to a low carbon economy, the move towards renewable energy. All of the minerals that are needed for this are contained in the wealth that we have sitting on the floor of our ocean.
Prime Minister, as you know, there has been increasing geopolitical interest in the Pacific region in recent years. What is your opinion on the role that China plays in the region? And also, what are your thoughts on the future of US-Pacific relations since the new administration has come in?
Good question again. I think China has filled a void that has been left by some of the other geopolitical powers, particularly the United States in the region. The Americans haven't been in the Pacific for a number of years in any significant way. And I think the previous administration under President Trump has distanced the US even further from the Pacific. The new administration under President Biden, of course, have made some noises about engaging further with the Pacific. We've yet to see what the substance of that engagement will be. But there's no doubt, as a region, we are of strategic geopolitical importance to the superpowers of the world. From our perspective as the Cook Islands, we're a fairly small player in that regard in our region. And we have engaged with both countries and a lot of our other partners, larger partners, for many years now. Of course, our traditional partner remains New Zealand, and of course Australia, who play a role, particularly with the Melanesian countries in the Pacific. But I expect that geopolitical powers will continue to play their game that they have for many, many years to come. And us as a smaller countries will just have to make sure that we don't get in the way of any of those power plays that may take place, and just do what we can to push our own country forward.
Well, there's a lot happening in the Pacific region, so let's talk about that after we come back from the break.
Sure.
Welcome back to Talanoa With Tupe. I'm here with the Prime Minister of the Cook Islands, the Honourable Mark Brown. Prime Minister, let's talk about Pacific regionalism.
Mm-hmm.
So the unity that once existed seems to have dissipated. The University of the South Pacific is in some disarray, and the Pacific Islands Forum is fractured. Has the Pacific Way in fact lost its way, and can it be recovered?
Mm-hmm. I think the Pacific Way won't lose its way. Certainly there are fractures. I think part of the way that the Pacific does its business, particularly at the leadership level, has been on the basis of talanoa, face-to-face, sitting down and meeting and talking and resolving things. This hasn't been possible for over a year. And the recent Pacific Island Leaders Forum meeting, which I attended, I was on one of our northern group islands in Puka Puka, zooming in to the meeting as everybody else was. So some of the issues around, you mentioned the fragmentation with the forum in particular, due to the appointment of our former Prime Minister to the post of Secretary General. I believe that if we hadn't met on a face-to-face basis over the period of days that we meet as forum leaders, I'm sure we wouldn't have got to the stage that we've got now. The process that was undertaken through a vote of members, of course, led to some extreme decisions made by the Micronesian countries, who held a firm viewpoint that there was a rotation policy that was in place. But from our side, we took our lead very clearly from the 2002 decision of the Pacific Island leaders that the appointment of the Secretary General should be on the basis of merit and the best person for the job at the time. When we came through this COVID, it was apparent that our organisation, the Pacific Islands Forum, would need someone with certain capabilities to be able to help our region get through this COVID situation. We nominated our former Prime Minister on the basis that this is a person who has strong relationship links with many of the other leaders. This is a person who was in charge of a country that was able to graduate, despite fairly limited circumstances, into high income status. A leader who's managed to keep very high standards in terms of our economic development. So it was our understanding that on this basis we would put forward the nomination of our Prime Minister. It appears that more than half of the leaders themselves felt that he was a viable candidate for this job, rather than rotating it around to somebody else. I believe, though, that the next steps forward are what has been proposed, a group of Pacific leaders with a representative from Polynesia, from Micronesia and from Melanesia, to sit together and see how we can address the issues raised by Micronesian leaders and look to bring them back into the fold. But there's no doubt that the value of being part of the forum far outweighs the losses that would be incurred by not being part of the forum. And I'm hopeful that all of our leaders will be able to see this and encourage the spirit of collaboration and cooperation that's been a hallmark of Pacific leadership for decades now. You spoke about the USP as well. For this, I expect this would be a political intervention required to resolve this issue. for ourselves, our country has developed our satellite campus of the USP in the Cook Islands to the extent where the vast bulk of our students attend that campus rather than the campus in Fiji. But the USP campus, or the USP, the university itself, is unique in being one of only 2 regional universities in the whole world. So it's a development that came out of our forum leaders from the 1960s. It's a institution that needs to be maintained for the benefit of the majority of our Pacific Island countries who use the USP to lift the knowledge and educational standards of their populations. Because we cannot afford to let these sorts of institutions go to waste. The future for any of our Pacific Island countries depends on people who are educated. It depends on a knowledge economy which is growing, and the USP is in a position to provide that to many, many countries, to all of our countries across the Pacific, and to all of our students potentially who'd like to join the USP. So these are 2 critical issues that are come to test us in probably the most testing time that we can be in the middle of COVID. So while countries are trying to prevent COVID getting into them, while countries are looking at ways of how we're going to get our economy back up and running, we've got this issue of our regionalism under threat as well, that really we cannot afford the time to be dealing with these, but we have to. It's no choice for us as leaders. So I expect to be talking to quite a few more leaders over the coming months to look at solutions, how we bring our family back together again.
So you're talking specifically about the fact that Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia and the Marshall Islands, have already started the formal process of leaving the forum. What does that mean for the Blue Pacific region?
Well, the Blue Pacific region is so large. The region is so huge. As I said, the process of removing oneself from the forum is not straightforward. It will take time for these countries to completely remove themselves. And we're hoping that within that time, we may be able to have dialogue enough with the leaders of these countries to be able to show them that being part of the family far outweighs the costs of leaving the family. And there are a number of institutions and organizations that are part of the PIFs that these countries are members of, that they may put in jeopardy by removing themselves from PIFs. There are a number of subsidiaries, such as the Forum Fisheries Agencies, which has been so effective in managing our fishery as a region. If we start to split and operate independently as sovereign EEZs across the Pacific, we lose our strength, we lose our ability to negotiate as a bloc, and we dilute the ability of us as Pacific countries being the stewards of the largest tuna fishery in the world. And that's just one area. There are many other areas of regionalism that are important that we maintain a collective and collaborative effort on.
Yes. Prime Minister, you are leading the Cook Islands during the time of a global pandemic, also at a time of major economic turmoil. In the future, when you look back on this time, what would you like to be able to tell your children and grandchildren about how you led the Cook Islands?
Good question. I think for me it's about just doing the best that you can. It's being able to look forward and see the big picture, see where you're going. If you liken it to us as Polynesians traveling in our waka, we know where we want to go. There are guides that show us the direction. There may be clouds that come at times, we can't see them, but we keep our picture on the big, keep our view on the big picture, on that direction. It doesn't matter about who comes and tries to slow us down. It doesn't matter about the little things that occur that may divert our attention. During these tough times, it's so important, as I mentioned about country-led, that we keep our focus, keep our direction, and keep moving in where we see the recovery will be. There's a lot of challenges that come to politicians, but we can't afford to let that divert us. Political life is always unstable. That's a reality of democracies. It's important that you don't divert yourself at the expense of political life. When you've got a country to lead and maintain, you take it through to the end.
Prime Minister, I know you have a schedule that is full of meetings, so thank you so much for your time today. Me taki maata e kia manuia, te atua te aroa.
Me take mata, tēnā koe.